Thank you for the welcome, and it is lovely to be with you. And can I say before I start, Roy and Jinha and kids, we are really glad you came back. Having had the experience of living overseas, you end up, how many of you have lived, in a country that you weren't born in, or you end up with this strange experience where you have these parallel lives. You have one life over there and you have one life here, and the two are both excellent in themselves, but they so rarely intersect that it's kind of sometimes a bit of a disconcerting experience. So that's why I say it's great that they've come back, and we love having you both here. I want to just give you a 30-second advertisement before I start, and that is an event that I'm involved with running at the end of July. Every year we run a Grow conference, and primarily it's targeted at elders and key leaders of local churches. The reason I just want to flag it with you is there'll be advertising that will come out, and Roy and Jinha will be able to tell you about it. But we have a guy by the name of Emilio Abdallah coming to speak at that conference. Now, when I first heard his name, I thought he must have been from the Middle East somewhere, but actually no, he's from Brazil. And if there's one place in the Adventist church that we have some interesting things happening and some interesting growth happening, it's Brazil. He's based in Sao Paulo, in central Brazil there. He is both a lecturer at an Adventist university there, as well as hands-on involved with planting new churches. And last year in his part of Brazil, just last year, they planted 150 new churches. And I think, wow, that's impressive. I want to hear more about that. So that's why we've got him coming at the end of July. And there'll be some advertising coming through your church soon if you haven't heard about that yet. And you'd be very welcome. But that's not what I'm here to share with you. I want to come into Scripture with you. And today I want to start by posing a question. The question goes like this: if you were given the task of changing the world, how would you do it? Now, we're going to set some limitations on the parameters that you have to change the world. You're not going to have multi-billion dollars like Donald Trump may or may not have. You're not going to have a military force behind you. In fact, you will live in an era where there is no mass communication. So satellite, TV, internet, scrub it, gone. You can't use that to change the world. It's an era where there is no motorised transport, no mass transport. Transport involves either your legs or the legs of an animal. That's it. Let's take it and make it a little more difficulty. Not only are you not rich, in fact you are poor. You have no formal education. You have no born-to-rule status. And those that know you question your parentage. They're the parameters. Take that, and how would you change the world? Oh, and by the way, you get to start your efforts to truly change the world at 30, and 3.5 years later it comes to an end. So now you've got all those parameters, you've boiled it down to about 3 years, and in those 3 years you have to change the world. How would you have done it? I want to look at how Jesus did it, because Jesus chose 12 ordinary men, and with them he changed the world. Now, yes, we know that of the 12, one of them failed. The other 11, well, it's actually interesting to look at them. And I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if I was to put you on the spot and to say, can you name all 12 of the disciples? If you're like me, you'd probably struggle to do it on the spot. So, when you think about the 12 disciples, what we're sometimes tempted to immediately think is here are these holy men of God who are somehow higher and better and greater than anything we could be, and yet when we look at them, what we discover is a reality is that they're far more like us than we might imagine. Just think about it for starters, the names of these men. So you have Peter, who is the rock. Not the rock, that's Jesus, but Peter the rock. You have James and John, who are sons of thunder. Ever thought about it, what it would be like to sit around the table with the sons of thunder and imagine what their conversation would have been like over the table? Then you have another one who was an assassin. And then you've got the tax collector, and you start putting these names together and you have the rock, the sons of thunder, the assassin and the tax collector, and it starts to sound more like World Wrestling Federation than, holy men called of God. So let's just go with this. If I was to throw out the question, and you can answer this one and say, what's the first disciple that comes to mind when we talk about the disciples? Who comes to mind? Anyone? Okay, John? Peter? If I made you go through the exercise of writing it down, my bet is that Peter probably would have come out number 1 and John number 2. So, we have Peter. Peter, he's the big mouth. He's the one that's first in, first out. He's the one that gets himself in trouble time and time again, but he's also the one that has an amazing faith. But I want, before we look further at Peter, to come look at the calling of the first disciples. Come with me to John chapter 1. And whether you've got Bible or device, they all work. So John chapter 1, and we'll look from about verse 35 there. We'll pick it up. So John chapter 1, verse 35, and I want to read this because sometimes we end up with the impression, and maybe Hollywood's partly to blame for this, when you look at the movie portrayals of the call of the disciples, it's almost like Jesus comes along and largely expressionless stands before these men and says, "Follow me." And they stand up like robots and they follow him. Whereas when you actually read the story, it's so much more dynamic and alive and almost humorous in spots that we just need to read it. So John chapter 1 and verse 35. The next day, John was there again, so this is John the Baptist, with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." Now, up until this point in time, John the Baptist is the one who's come before Jesus to prepare the way for the promised one who is to come. So he's been preaching and teaching and baptizing and building up a following of disciples. They were his disciples, John the Baptist's disciples or followers. But he's also been teaching them that he is not the one, there is one that is coming. And so finally, when he appears and he sees Jesus just passing by and says, "Look, the Lamb of God," for his disciples, this is not secret code. This is big flashing neon light saying, the one you've been waiting for is here. This is the man. And so, a couple of John the Baptist disciples hear it, and verse 37 says, when the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" Not exactly the warm and fuzzy invitation, the way it reads in this translation anyway. And they said, "Rabbi," or teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went, They saw where he was staying. They spent that day with him. It was about the 10th hour. So it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 10th hour from sunrise. And there, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they see him, they follow him. Where are you staying? And he says, well, come and check it out. And they spend the rest of the day with him. But it's interesting, if you go on and read further, this is not the point where they begin to follow him full time as such. But this is the first step. Verse 40, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we've found the Messiah, that is the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. So let's put Andrew up here on the board. Andrew and Peter are brothers. Andrew is the one that responds first. And he gets his brother and says, we've got him, we've found him, come. And he comes. Then it reads further on, the next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, follow me. And Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, we've found the one Moses wrote about in the law. There's this sense of excitement. We've found him, we've been waiting, we've got him. And about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And notice the reaction. Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip's response, come and see. And when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false. How do you know me? Nathanael asked. And Jesus answered, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. And then Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. And so what you end up with is this, and we could follow through with more of them, which we won't do this morning, but what you end up with is this curious, different way in which they come to end up following Jesus. Now, of the 12 disciples, 11 of them are from the same general area. But let's come back to Peter, because Peter, as we've said, he's the one that's eager, he's aggressive, he is outspoken, he is bold, but he's not exactly got a spine of steel. He will leap in, but once he realises what he's done, he kind of will run away just as fast as he's leapt in. Sometimes we're probably a bit tough on Peter, because when you think about Peter, remember the time that the disciples are out in the boat out on Lake Galilee and Jesus comes walking across the water to them. And it's Peter, they all see him coming, but it's Peter, when they realise who it is, that gets out of the boat to walk on the water. Now think about that for a moment. If you had been one of the 12 in that boat, would you have even thought of the possibility of getting out of that boat and walking across the water to Jesus? I doubt I'd have even thought of it, to be honest. And the other 11 didn't think of it, but Peter has this amazing faith that he exercises at that point, and he gets out and he starts to walk across the water, takes his eyes off Jesus and starts to sink. And it just illustrates Peter beautifully. And maybe as we look at these 12 disciples, maybe you look at Peter and say, yeah, I can identify with Peter. Peter is often teamed up with John, and it's interesting when we think about the name that Jesus gives to him. He gives him the name Peter, Cephas. And he's not the rock, but it is a rock. Some say pebble, small rock, whatever you want to say. John, of all the disciples, was probably the one that was closest to Peter as we read the Gospels. And in the Gospel of John, John repeatedly refers to Peter as Simon Peter. In the other Gospels, sometimes it will be Simon and sometimes it will be Peter. John, it's Simon Peter. What's going on with that? Well, it seems when you read through where it's used, Simon is who he was. It's his old name, but it's also his old self. And when Peter is rebuked by Jesus, it'll be Simon. And when he is not rebuking him, it will be Peter. John, why does he use Simon and Peter? Because of all the disciples, he knows Peter better than anyone else. And he knows that Peter is not just what he was, nor is he just what Jesus is making him into. He is both those things. He is Simon and he is Peter. And Jesus calls Peter and uses him. It's interesting too that while Peter, we know he's married, he has a mother-in-law, we know he's a commercial fisherman, we know that more than once he goes back to his commercial fishing business, so it's obviously a business that others are able to keep on ticking over. So he has that as his backstop, his insurance policy, if he likes. We know too that even though we sometimes think of Peter as weak, when it came to the crucifixion of Christ, when Jesus was there being flogged, it's Peter that was within eyesight of Jesus. There were only two that stuck by, John and Peter. Now we know that when Peter was challenged, aren't you one of them? You sound like a Galilean, and he, with all his curses and whatnot, he denies that's who he is. But Jesus looks at him. He's saved in that moment. But Peter is brave enough to try and be there in the presence of Jesus to the end, but he just isn't quite strong enough. Brave, but not quite strong enough. And yet, when we look at him on the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit comes on those disciples, he preaches bravely with no hesitation. And when later he dies for Christ, he dies crucified on a cross, upside down, because he did not consider himself worthy to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus was. He became what Jesus intended him to be. Andrew's an interesting one, because what we really have with the disciples is not just a group of 12, but subgroups within that. We have the four, Peter, Andrew, James and John, also brothers. They make up the inner circle of the disciples. These are the closest. These are the ones we actually know the most about as well. Andrew is the one that brings Peter one-on-one to Jesus. And we see through Andrew's life, he's, if you like, out of this four, Andrew's probably more the introvert than any of them. Andrew's the quieter one. He never really sets a foot wrong when you read through the Gospels, except when all the disciples get it wrong. But it's Andrew, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, who is it that brings the little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fishes to Jesus and says, here, this boy has this? It's Andrew. Andrew's the one that feels comfortable and able to just repeatedly bring one person at a time to Jesus. No record of him preaching at Pentecost, though he might have, but there's no record of it. He's the one that one-on-one brings people to Jesus. He's happy not to have the limelight. Actually, as I've looked at this, it reminds me a little bit of our 2 boys. We've got, well, one's 18, so I better not call him a boy, but he's my boy. The 18-year-old, he's probably more like Peter. He wants to be up the front, in the action, leading out, doing things. And his brother, he will be anywhere but up the front, leading. If he can be sitting behind the camera or on the sound desk, out of sight, out of mind, he's happy. And in a way, that's the Peter and Andrew dynamic. And Andrew's happy with that. He's content in what Jesus has made him to be. Then we come to James and John, and we kind of talk about them as a unit because they were very similar. They are often referred to together. They are sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee. It's actually James that dies first. Actually, just let me comment on Andrew. Andrew, he dies lashed to a cross at the orders of a Roman governor because the governor's wife had become a Christian and would not recant. So Andrew was a brave man. James and John, James is the first of the disciples to die, killed by Herod, at the sword of Herod. James and John are ambitious, zealous, passionate, fiery. They're very black and white. You know, it's James and John that when they are travelling with Jesus and they've gone through a Samaritan village and they've preached the good news that Jesus has brought with, and the whole village rejects them. They don't want to know what they've got to say. It's James and John who turn around to Jesus and say, "Oh, should we call fire down on them? You know, burn them to a crisp. They haven't listened. They've had their chance." And Jesus says, that's not what I'm here for. James and John, you know, they jockey for position. They've got their elbows out trying to be, you know, figure out this, who's going to be the greatest. And maybe because John was a little more prominent and James was the older brother and he probably should have been more prominent, but he wasn't. You know, who knows what's going on with that. And yet, it's Peter, James and John that were on the mountain with Jesus when Jesus was transfigured into this bright white light that's light, you know, like a flash of lightning, as one of the Gospels say. It's James and John that Jesus calls. It's James and John's mother, who is also a disciple, referred to, Salome, referred to in the Gospels. It's their mother that comes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, when your kingdom comes in all its power, can my boys sit beside you when you sit on your throne, one on your right and one on your left?" And she doesn't know what she's asking. But we see, you know, that family dynamic. And yet Jesus calls James and John and uses them. James, as we've said, dies fairly early on in the piece, dies for his faith. It's John that lives to be an old man. It's John that's beside the cross as Jesus is dying. It's John to whom Jesus says, "John, look after my mother." And history tells us that he did. It's John who never seems to complain. He's there in exile on the Isle of Patmos, living in a cave, lying, sleeping probably on rock, where he writes the book of Revelation, and you have this glorious picture of Jesus, but there's not a word of complaint in it. He becomes the disciple that we know today as the apostle of love. Jesus takes him and molds him into what he wants him to be. It's also interesting when you think about John. He is the one that while he has this black and white side of his character, he becomes black and white about the goodness and divinity and goodness of said it twice, but Jesus. It's John who, when he writes, will often write without qualification. If you ask something in prayer, believing, you will receive. No qualification. It's that sense of the black and white. Now we come along and we say, we need to qualify it. You know that if you ask for a Lamborghini, he's not going to give you a Lamborghini because, it's talking about in accordance with his will and the other statements that we find in the Bible and all of those sort of qualifications, which we understand. But John isn't going to take the time to explain that. It's just bang, here's the statement, move on. Grand theology. And so we finish with the four and we come to the next group of four. The first of which is Philip, probably with one L, not two L, but it doesn't matter. Then we have Bartholomew. Oh, look, I better check and spell that right. And then we have Thomas and Matthew. Now, Philip. I kind of like Philip, just because it's an interesting insight. Remember, each of these different people God calls. Philip. Philip is the bean counter. He's the logistics manager for the disciples, if you want to look at it that way. He's the one that knows what things cost, how much they've got in the bank, how accessible it is, all of that sort of thing. He's got the answers instantly. He's the classic process person. And Jesus calls him and uses him. He's the one that is more focused on the detail than the big picture. How do we know some of this? Well, one of the details that we have is, again, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Have a read of it sometime. I haven't got time to read it today. When the 5,000 are there, remember it's 5,000 men because they count the men as they count it then, so add women and children and you could be 15, 20,000, whatever the number was, a lot of people. Jesus looks out on this crowd and turns to Philip, and in the Gospel of John says, because he was testing him, and says, Philip, can you organise a meal for all these people? Philip's instant response is, but Lord, it would cost 8 months' wages to feed all these people, and we can't do it. He knows the detail. He's got it all lined up in his head. And it's then that Andrew steps in and shows this faith that is faith enough to bring a small boy with 5 loaves and 2 fishes to Jesus and says, Lord, here's what this little boy's got. And Jesus takes those 5 loaves and 2 fishes and utterly blows the mind of Philip. I reckon he did. He brings Philip, along with everyone else there, to see what is possible in the kingdom of God when Philip was just concerned about the dollars and cents and what could happen and what could not. And Jesus says, let me show you another way, and does. Don't forget, though, that Philip does follow Jesus. He's quick to follow Jesus. And Jesus uses all those qualities that he brings. It's actually Philip. So John is the only one that doesn't die a premature death. Philip died, we believe, being stoned to death at Heliopolis about 8 years after James was killed by Herod. So he died early in the piece. It's also Philip, that God uses to walk with the Ethiopian and baptise him and preach to the Samaritans, and you follow it through in the book of Acts. He's used amazingly. Bartholomew, we also know as Nathaniel. Bartholomew is just Bar, son of Ptolemy, or Bartholomew. That's how we get it. He's the one that's under the fig tree that Jesus sees. He's the one that he describes as a true son of Israel with nothing false in him. And yet it's this guy that has certain prejudices. When he's told that Jesus comes from Nazareth, his instant response is, oh, Nazareth! We know about Nazareth. Nothing good's ever come out of Nazareth. It's maybe it's not racial in tone, but this is the guy that comes with his prejudices. And Jesus takes him and changes him and uses him, and he becomes somebody that, as history tells us, preached in Persia, India, possibly Armenia, and died for his faith. Amazing. Thomas is interesting. When I say Thomas, you think of doubting. Correct. Anyone from India here? You go to parts of India and you mention Thomas And doubting doesn't rate on the radar. What rates is Thomas, the evangelist. So Thomas, maybe we all identify a little bit with Thomas. He's the one that perhaps appeals to the spirit of our age, where he says, unless I can see it for myself and touch it for myself and know for myself, I will not believe. That's Thomas. And Jesus appears before him and says, Thomas, my hands touch my side. And it's then that Thomas falls on his knees before God and says, my Lord and my God. And from that moment on, nothing can shake him. He becomes not Thomas the doubter, but Thomas the evangelist. And what Jesus says is, blessed is the one who, not seeing and not touching, believes. It's Thomas who has this sense of, what would you say, almost triumphal defeatism. When Jesus goes to heal Lazarus, he's going back into an area where the religious leaders have been intent on killing Jesus. And so when Jesus turns to his disciples after a delay during which Lazarus has died, he turns to his disciples and says, let's go to Lazarus. It's Thomas who basically shakes his head. I imagine him shaking his head and with a long face saying, we will go and we will die with our Saviour. He's prepared to, and he does. Look, in the end, he goes to India. There are churches today that are there because of Thomas. He is the one who plants the Christian church in India and ends up martyred for his faith in India. Matthew, the tax collector. Now, I don't know, a number of years back, I used to do my tax for myself before I thought, no, it's easier just to use an accountant. And for a couple of years in a row, I'd get this lovely letter from the tax department saying, you have been selected for a random audit. Oh, great. I have to say that after it actually happened 2 years and then a gap, and then the fourth year happened again. And that year I'd held back a couple of, everything I had all the documentation. I thought, the third time I got it, I thought, man, haven't they learnt? It's all there. The funny thing was, the third time I did it, I found some extra receipts. So I put them all into the envelope and sent it off, and I got a bit more back, which was very nice. They never did it again after that. And I went to an accountant. Anyway, we get this sense of nervousness when we get called up by the tax department, even if we've done all the right thing. Multiply that by a factor of 10. Back in this day, so the Romans would contract out, in essence, the tax collecting business. And so Matthew would have bid for the tax collecting business. There would have been a part in the contract that said you are required to return X to the Roman government, and anything you make over and above that, that's yours. So it was all about the money. It was all about the greed. And again, maybe different people go through stages in their life where life is all about the money. It's all about building the bank account. That's Matthew. Only the terms on which he does it are pretty rotten. He's a collaborator with the occupying Roman armies. And the people around him would genuinely have looked at him as a complete scumbag because of it. He ripped his own people off in order to get rich himself and collaborated with the Roman government. There's something interesting about Matthew, though. When Jesus comes to Matthew and calls him, the Bible just tells us that he instantly followed Jesus. The commitment that Matthew made was far greater in a sense than those that were fishermen. The fishermen could keep going back to the fishing business. For Matthew, when he walked out of that tax booth and walked away from his tax collecting business, there were 100 other hungry vultures that would step into that void, and he could never go back again. He was done as a tax collector the moment he walked away. That was his level of commitment. And what he does next is really interesting. And maybe this is again giving us insight into the different ways in which we share our faith. Matthew throws an almighty party for all his friends and associates, and at that party introduces Jesus to them. Here's my friend Jesus. Jesus often chooses those that we would consider despicable, and they follow him. Then we come to the last four, the ones we hardly know anything about. We have James, another James, James the Lesser. And you know what we know about him? That's about it. He's Mr. Anonymous. Don't know what he did particularly, don't know where he went. There was no particular recognition that we find for him in the Gospels. And yet the thing that encourages me with this one is Jesus called James as well and used him, even with the little we know about him. We come then to Judas, and this is the Judas that is Judas not Iscariot. So he's the other Judas. And pretty much the only thing that we know about him is that he asked Jesus a really good question in the upper room when they're all gathered there together and Jesus has washed their feet. And some others of the disciples ask some dumb questions. Judas is the one who asks a good question. As far as we know, this humble and possibly insightful disciple, from what we know, spreads the gospel into Turkey. There's some history that suggests he actually healed the king of Edessa, and for his faith ended up being clubbed to death. Jesus called him too. Then you have these two guys. Simon, the Zealot. Let me use some words to explain Simon. We'll put you on different sides of the room and figure out which side you belong on. So on this side, Simon, the Zealot, the patriot, the freedom fighter, the political activist. Or if you're on the other side of the room, he's the terrorist, the conspirator, the outlaw, the violent assassin. This is Simon, and Jesus calls him. He probably follows Jesus for all the wrong reasons, because his whole life has been about overthrowing the Romans. They were called zealots because they were very zealous. They would go around, as history tells us, with a concealed knife in their cloaks, a curved knife, and they would sneak up on people like Roman soldiers and collaborators, tax collectors, and plunge the knife into places that would end their life. That's Simon the Zealot, disciple of Jesus. A man of fierce loyalty, amazing passion, courage and zeal, rightly directed, nothing could stop him. And that's what Jesus does. Somewhere he goes from following Jesus from the wrong reasons to being a genuine disciple of Jesus. History tells us that it's a suggestion more than anything concrete, but that he possibly preached as far as Britain before he disappears in history. Amazing guy. And it's interesting when we think, these guys are more on the outer circle, these guys are the inner circle. Jesus calls all of these. He also calls Judas the example of what not to be. He's the only non-Galilean. His call to follow Christ is not recorded in the Gospels, and there may be a reason for that. He followed Jesus and he gave his life, but he never gave his heart. It was Judas who, when Jesus' feet was anointed with expensive perfume, was offended by the cost of that, because imagine the good we could do for the poor with that. And he was obviously feeling a little poor that day himself. He was the one who would pocket extra money on the side. And think too, just for a moment, as we come towards the end, think too about Judas' betrayal of Jesus. His betrayal of Jesus was not something done on a whim or in a moment. It was a premeditated, planned betrayal of Jesus. He went and he struck a deal with the religious leaders. They did not do it immediately. They had to wait for the moment when the time was right, when the crowds weren't around, so it didn't cause a big scene and there wasn't a riot or whatever they were worried about would happen. They choose a quiet moment, scripted with Judas, who has this pre-planned signal to kiss his Lord to signify that this is the man. It's a premeditated action, and Jesus knew about it. Because when they're there in the upper room and Jesus one by one washes the feet of the disciples, he also washes, think about the symbolism of this, he washes the feet of Judas and says to him, go do what you have to do. And the Gospels simply record that Judas gets up and he leaves that gathering and he goes out into the darkness. And it's not just talking about the fact that it was night time. And it's not too far down the track after the betrayal that the shattered and broken Judas goes out and hangs himself. And the two gospel accounts add more to it, and maybe to block the ears of the kids, because the Gospels actually tell us that he hangs himself and he obviously then falls, and it says his guts spilled out. Gruesome, horrible end. His life is that lost opportunity. And so I come back to the question that I asked at the beginning. If you had to change the world, how would you have done it? The way Jesus did it was to take 12 ordinary men and a bunch of other followers and work through them. And when you look at those people that he used, they were people that were taken from what they were and they were changed forever. They died with purpose and hope, and they knew that they lived for something that had meaning. But there was nothing, as you look through these men, there was nothing in their backgrounds, their personalities, their status, their families of origin. There was nothing in that which would have caused us to select them. And so I ask one more question. If Jesus were here physically today and he looked around this room, would he choose you and me? And let me suggest to you, the very fact that you are sitting here would say that he has already called you. It just comes down to what we do in response to that call. God bless.